What's up everyone, Kevin Allen aka The Geek from DFS Army here to do a tutorial for the Domination Station Optimizer NBA Classic Mode system. So quick breakdown of how to use the Domination Station to create NBA lineups. Let's start with the basics. Up top here you have a choice of site. FanDuel, DraftKings, Fantasy Draft are the ones we cover for NBA. And you can select your game type. For the purpose of this demonstration, we'll do DraftKings Classic Mode. Right here in this button, you can select the slate that you're interested in. Note that we have every slate covered. Turbos, the nights, these are for today. Some for even for tomorrow's slate. I'm going to choose the main slate. Now, when you choose your slate, the first thing that will happen is the games filter will pop up, and it will give you a breakdown of all of the games, the spreads, and the game totals. Obviously, if you're using this to help make your lineup decisions, you'll see that we want to target games with high spreads, with high totals, and ideally not such high spreads. So good mix here. Notice like the Memphis game here, not too bad. Close spreads, Boston, Miami. So we want that, but we also want high scoring teams like the Bucks. Next up, you have the filter system where you can filter through the various, and let me actually reset these settings so we get the standard stuff here. Refresh projections. We'll talk about what that does in a second. But right here, you filter your players, and you can use this to see point guard, shooting guard, forward, power forward, center, or all in one place. And the first thing I always recommend doing is sorting by fantasy points per dollar to see the highest values, the best value players on the slate. These are the ones that will show up in the most lineups. Green is good. We'll get to some of these other readings in a moment, but let's go through the rest of this. Salary range slider, not something you normally want to use. This will remove players outside of the salary range. I don't use it in NBA at all. Most sports should actually avoid using that. Fantasy points range. This I actually don't mind using, and I do use it for NBA. This will just filter out players with really, really low projections. It's not that they're going to show up in many of your lineups. They will on small slates. Occasionally you'll get these players projected for 9 or 10 points. There's no avoiding it when there aren't that many players to choose from and you're making a lot of lineups. But I don't like to, it speeds up the optimization process to remove some kind of garbage players from the player pool. So I do like to filter out between 15 to 17 fantasy points players projected there. And even for cash games, I might go as high as 20 or 21 fantasy point filters. Salary cap, again, this is really something I'd use in different sports, not something I'd use in classic mode NBA. So what this does is change the actual max salary cap so you can force it to not spend the full salary. That's not something I would ever do in classic mode NBA. And here you set the number of lineups. You can have from anywhere from 1 to 300 lineups. Now, some additional options here that you have to choose from: optimal or tournament mode. I get this question a lot. What is tournament mode? Tournament mode should pretty much always use tournament mode, and it doesn't mean it's making GPP lineups. What it means, what we do with tournament mode is it's a math formula that works with max exposure limits to spread out exposures to players that you have set a max exposure limit on across a run of 20, 40, 100, 300 lineups, whatever you're doing. So essentially the way this equation works is rather than a linear max exposure limit, which would essentially say if I'm making 10 lineups and I set a player to 50%, they would show up in the first 5 lineups generated if they're a good value, and not in the final 5 lineups generated. I don't like the way that mixes players in. So essentially what tournament mode does is it allows the player to be in 50% of the lineups that have been generated thus far. And if they're in more than 50%, they're ineligible for the next lineup until it levels to 50%. Essentially what that does is spread out the exposure of that specific player across the entire run of however many lineups you're making. So essentially always use tournament mode. And no, it doesn't mean that you've created a tournament or a GPP lineup. That is not what that does. And there's a long form explanation here. We try to explain all the functions of the optimizer when you scroll over these little eyes. DFS Army points or base projections, always leave that on DFS Army points. Those are the DFS Army custom projection system. Base projection are the projections we get from our data provider, and we keep them in there. I like to compare how they look to compared to our projections, and you'll note, for example, today, Eric Bledsoe, this is after the slate, Eric Bledsoe wound up scoring, 50 fantasy points. He went crazy, 55, I think it was. Another one who went nuts was Chris Middleton. I think he scored maybe 70 fantasy points. And, this is the difference between custom projections and base projections. You'll see, our projection system was all over these two players. Where was I? Okay, so DFS Army points always lead to DFS Army points. Number of uniques, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 per lineup. What that means, what that is explaining is how many unique players there are between each lineup generated, 1 to 2 to 3, how many unique. So essentially, if you're making 2 lineups and you have 1 unique as your selection, then the optimizer will build the first lineup and make sure that the second lineup built has at least 1 different player from the first. That seems very obvious, and that's the sort of tightest player pool approach to generating lineups. As you increase the number of uniques, you get a wider spread of players in your player pool. So you can go, I usually use 3 uniques in NBA, so it makes sure that each lineup has 3 players different from the lineup generated before or for any other lineup that has been generated thus far. Finally, some other things to look at here. Force player from the last game into the flex position. That's just self-explanatory. We want the maximum ability to player swap on DraftKings, so we want players from the last game put in the flex position. What this doesn't tell you is also it defaults to the highest salary player in the latest game into the flex position. Prioritize completing lineups of max exposure settings. This is a setting that we put in place essentially for 2 reasons. One, because tournament mode math does not allow for every single player in the pool to be under 50%, and yet a lot of people do want to do that, so it will sort of override your max exposure setting for a little bit until it kind of levels out. It's just an important thing to always leave checked off. It also just generally allows, when you click generate 50 lineups, you want your 50 lineups. This will override certain restrictions that you as the user might put in place, not knowing that those restrictions create a situation where you can't actually create a lineup. Finally, randomization percentage. What is this? This is a basic randomization formula, plus or minus. So one of the things I like to do, if 2 players are the same salary and they're within 0.2 of a point or half of a point projection of one another or even less, it will always default to the player who's slightly higher projected, because an optimizer's job is to create the highest projected lineup that it possibly can given its constraints. So we add this randomization allowance in here, which will give a plus or minus 5% or 10, whatever you set it to. I usually go 3 to 5%, just so that those players who are really, really close will get mixed into lineups a little bit more generously than if it was just linear and taking the one guy who was 0.2 of a point projected higher than the next. That 0.2 of a point really doesn't lead to tournament wins for sure, so it's not that big of a difference. So I'd rather allow for the randomization a little bit. It'll give me a better player mix in my lineups. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. The negative of randomization is if you're running runs of 150 lineups, each run will be mildly, just slightly different because you're adding that factor, and it's a plus or minus factor. So in a 5% randomization, plus or minus on a 10-point projection, that player will show up as either 10.5, somewhere between 9.5 and 10.5 for every lineup generated. So it's a fairly wide range, 5%, and going even less is perfectly fine. Okay. Now down to the player pool. Some of the details that you can see here. First, you've got a button here if you want to create a player pool. A lot of people like to create their own player pools. The easiest way to do it is to uncheck all and then kind of check back in the players you want to use. That's definitely something I do for other sports, not so much for NBA, but for other sports. So that's your ability to do that. This is your player position, team, opponent. Couple of extra details here. And one rating is our internal proprietary matchup rating system for players. Higher numbers are better. Sometimes you sort by and one rating. You can see players that appear to be in very good spots. And there are a lot of factors in this. I'm not going to get into it that go into the and one rating, matchups, game totals, player totals, value, all kinds of stuff go into that rating system. So it basically grabs players in good spots. DVP percentage. This is the percentage of scoring expected for this position group when facing this defense. So we want numbers. So essentially what this number says, and this is also a proprietary measure that we've come up with, this measure says that essentially point guards that face Golden State score 100% or 4% above their mean expectation on average. So we want, Drew Holiday, for example, today went crazy. So he crushed it today. A lot of these guys did. So the DVP is a really, really strong indicator of if a player would have a good game. Russell had a great game, and sometimes, hey, that was 96. So it's not the end-all, be-all, but it is a good measure, and we want to kind of avoid situations where players are facing facing teams that really, really limit their position group. DVP has its value, and it's not the end-all, be-all, but it's a really important measure, and it's awesome to have it on screen here. Again, I already mentioned fantasy points per dollar. This is a measure of value. So for 7,900, for example, a 40-point player is projected for 5.16 times value. Here, Kyle Lowry was projected at 44, so that's 6 times value. It's very, very good value play, and so on and so forth. A higher number is better. Minutes expectation, points per minute. Again, baseline projection, DFS Army projection, fantasy points. So as a user, a couple of final details here. You as the user have full control over the Domination station and the lineups that are generated, and a couple of things you can do here. Number one, you can adjust projections as you like. So if you really love Drew Holiday today, you can certainly just change that number, raise it up a little bit. Another way to go is to use our like, love, adore functions. And as you can see here, what these do is give it a projection boost. So if you click like, you get a 5% boost. If you click love, you've got a 10% boost. And if you click adore here, you give them an automated 15%. But I like to use that because I feel like if I've given a player a 15% boost above their DFS Army projection and they're still not showing up, then maybe the Dom station and the projection system knows something I don't know. So if they're not showing up with a 15% boost, I usually don't use them. But of course, don't be afraid to make a modification to a projection as you see fit. You control the Domination Station Optimizer. It's fully customizable. So the power's in your hand here. Now, a couple other columns we have going on here. First of all, projected ownership. This comes into play later on as we're generating lineups, but if you want to avoid chalk or high-owned players, this will give you an idea of who the market is going to be on heavily. Exposure min and exposure max. Okay, so another thing that we control, if you're making a lot of lineups, as I said, in tournament mode, you can either, if you want to make sure that you get 10% Drew Holiday, you can certainly set his exposure at minimum at 10%. If you want to make sure that if you're getting too much Drew Holiday and you want to make sure you're not getting 100%, you can control it by setting a max exposure limit. The better way to use this, and one of our innovations here with DFS Army, is by allowing you to do this from the exposures tab. Let me show you how that works. One of the nice things as you're creating a player pool is you can control everything right here in the exposures box. So I just ran 10 lineups. And you'll note that some of these players were 50%, were 100% owned. Kyle Lowry and Eric Bledsoe. So you might say, well, maybe I don't want 100% Kyle Lowry, so I can set his max exposure at 50%. I could do it right from there. I can adjust his projection slightly lower if I want. Same for all of the various position groups. If I see somebody that I think I'm getting too much exposure to, I can control it right from here, I can raise a projection. I can set a minimum exposure. If I said, hey, I want 40% Ibaka and he's only showing up in 10%, I can set his minimum exposure to 40%. And note, as I run this tool, we will have 40% Ibaka. Beautiful. Now, once you've ran your lineup, now, one last detail. Very important. Reset settings, refresh projections. A lot of people always ask, how do you get the optimal lineup? What's the optimal? What are the settings? There are no settings for the optimal lineup. Essentially, the optimal is the highest projected lineup based on our projection system on any given slate. Here's how you get it. Reset settings, refresh projections, click optimize. The first lineup generated will be the highest projected lineup possible given the current set of projections. That's it. It's right here. That's your top optimal. One of the important things to note, this is last updated at 6:55 p.m. We update projections constantly throughout the day, all the way up till 7 p.m. lock. So they don't refresh automatically on screen. You have to click refresh projections to get the latest projections. You can look at the timestamp as you click it, and if you see it change, you know that the projections have changed. In addition, in DFS Army Slack, our pros will always send out a channel tag notifying members when the Domination Station has been updated, but it happens so often for NBA that at some point, just click refresh, close to lock, and run it. That's how it's done. I usually assume that 5 minutes before lock is about as late as I can wait, especially if you're mass multi-entering and you have to do a run of 20 or 50 or something like that and make an edit. Now, let's say you're done creating your lineups and you want to download them and upload them to DraftKings. You click download. Let's see if we can get this whole process on screen. There we go. I've downloaded a set of lineups. Let me open DraftKings and I'll show you the process of uploading them. It's really, really simple. Click on lineups. Click upload lineups. Click on upload CSV. Now, one cool thing about our generator is the number after lineups is always going up. So no matter how many times you've downloaded this, you'll always be able to scroll all the way down to the bottom and you'll find the newest setup. Now, of course, these games are over, so that didn't work. But you get the idea. It would upload the CSV. Those lineups would show up in your account. They're still not in a game. Once you've uploaded them, then you would go to the lobby, open up a game, and click enter all to enter those lineups. There's another video explaining how to do a mass edit. So hopefully this gives you a baseline idea of how to use the Domination Station Optimizer to create lineups for NBA. One last component, if you do have stacking ideas where you want to force players to be used together or not to be used together, for example, somebody today asked me actually about avoiding pairing Bledsoe with Middleton because they're both on the same team now. With Chris Middleton, so you would say stack point guard Bledsoe with exactly 0 of Chris Middleton. You can create a rule, and therefore no lineups would be created with Middleton and Bledsoe together. You can also say exactly 1 of Chris Middleton. This will force Bledsoe to be in every lineup that he's in, will have Middleton in it. You as the user control it. Another thing that you can control, if you're getting too many players from one team, you would go allow at most 3 players from Golden State, and you can set a rule that will stop the Domination Station from using more than 3 players from this particular team. Very important to note that these are if-then statements, and so you have to kind of read them with logic. Use at most 3 for Golden State. That doesn't mean it's going to force 3. That would be at least. If I wanted to make sure I had 3, I would use at least 3 players from Golden State. If I want to make sure I have no more than 3, I would use at most. And if I want exactly 3, I can say exactly 3 players. So you have the control. And in addition, again, we have the control to force players to be used together or to be not used in the same lineup. A very common one is to allow 0 Harden if you're using Westbrook and vice versa. Those types of things where 2 players on the same team will eat from each other's plate. All right, hope this helped. Good luck crushing NBA this season. Thanks for watching.